So John mentioned this book starts in 2019 in May. You know, the 2-day conference, 15 speakers. Those 15 speakers talks were then turned into essays for the book, and the book is then expanded to a total of 41 contributions. I'm going to read some introduction. Hopefully frame the project. That'll then set up conversation with Fred and Ignacio. The history of graphic design pedagogy begins with a statement by Kathy McCoy, whom I studied while at Cranbrook Academy Art in the mid-90s. I do not recall exactly when Kathy made the statement, but it would have been a few years after graduating school, when I was establishing my studio practice and teaching at Art Center, Cal Arts, and Otis. I'm certain it was communicated over the phone when I asked for teaching advice. Kathy said, there's Cranbrook, there's Kathy. Kathy said graphic design moves from a professional practice to a discipline when design writes its own histories and theories. Over the years, as I lived in Los Angeles and then in San Francisco, I've considered the historicity of her pronouncement. Even as the parlance shifted from that of LA Valley girls to that of Silicon Valley programmers, from dude, this is like totally awesome, to design thinking, interdisciplinarity, and problem solving. I frequently toyed with the terms by which we describe design, especially as they relate to McCoy's statement on the quote discipline of graphic design. Today, when design calls for inter, trans, multidisciplinary strategies, I continue to explore when and if graphic design was, is, or could become a discipline. Spurred on by this phone call and by years of teaching, I set out to understand how we tell these stories and how we transmit this history to our students. The following then is structured as a conversation between myself and my peers. As Kathy explained in one of our many follow-up conversations, when professional practice led education, graphic design was a professional orientation at best. When graphic design education started breaking new ground, it became more like a discipline. The first part of our history there was the service industry, also called commercial arts. The sense of graphic design professionalism arrived in the late to mid 60s when it split from advertising with the rise of corporate identity. Kathy will hang out with us for a while. That lasted to the late 60s and early 70s before education started taking the ascendancy. I do think there was at least a 10-year period where design had become a profession, where we left behind the service to industry model. At that point, design moves in a disciplinary direction. What does the term discipline mean in light of graphic design history? And what does discipline mean relative to practices of reading and writing? In any discussion, okay. In any discussion of discipline, references to Foucault's discipline and punishment, the birth of the prisoner, unavoidable. The French title of the book telegraphs the interest of surveillance in the notion of disciplinarity, sense of watching and being watched, and a sense of control that stems from both. Foucault argues to the historical rise of what he will call disciplinarity or control society, namely how populations are managed within the modern West. Foucault describes changes in the penal system in Western societies after the democratic revolutions of the 18th century as a mode of punishment related to the power of the sovereign, spectacle for all the subjects, to forms of control involving self-policing, self-regulation, and the internalization of disciplinary power. Classic example of modern discipline is that of the panoptic prison, where guards were stationed in the central watchtower. The tower's design renders the presence of the guards invisible. They can at any time observe and regulate the actions of the prisoners from within the centralized structure, because the prisoner never knows when they are being watched. They internalize the power dynamics and assume that they're always being watched. Foucault provides a foundational statement on control society, a useful way of thinking about how we self-regulate within our own disciplinary homes. But there are far less theoretical ways to approach the question of design discipline. A contemporary form of disciplinary control comes to us by way of Yelp or other self-generated content platforms in the form of reviews, ranked lists, and judgments of our peers and audiences. The scrutiny of the other disciplines keep us in order. The scrutiny of institution produces discipline. To return to McCoy's statement, one could say, as designers construct their histories and theories, they in turn discipline themselves. But the term discipline need not be punitive. It can also be a, quote, shared commitment. Deb Littlejohn draws a distinction between practice and discipline with the recourse to Thomas Kuhn, who suggests that a discipline is a set of, quote, shared values and techniques. In a footnote to her dissertation, Building a Theory of Relations Among Academic Culture, Professional Identity, and the Design of Teaching Environment, she writes, practice refers to the design industry and the activities associated with professional services, advertising, advising clients, creating concepts, and producing prototypes. In a second sense, practice is a coordinated effort formed around a particular activity, as in the carrying out of some action. A discipline is defined as a set of shared commitments to patterns in thinking and behaviors common to an academic community in a given field. Okay, let's see here. Typically, one would start a history of graphic design pedagogy with the Bauhaus, because those who attended the school are thought to have held a set of shared principles and commitments. And there's been extensive research in this field. But as Argentine painter Thomas Maldonado explained in Home Journal 89 in 1963, he says, this is Maldonado here, the Bauhaus didactics, particularly its preliminary course, was a question of exaltation of expression, intuition, and action, above all, learning by doing. But this educational philosophy is in crisis. It is incapable of assimilating the new types of relations between theory and practice, gendered by the most recent scientific developments. We know now that theory must be impregnated with practice, practice with theory. It is impossible to act today without knowledge, or to know without doing. Following Maldonado, I situate the historical concerns of the study in the post-war moment in which theory was as important as practice, a period after the Bauhaus, as the title makes clear. The pedagogy of the old school, among the most important post-Bauhaus design programs, would become instrumental in disseminating its ideas with the United States and internationally after the war. Ulm was established in 1950 with private funds from Ingersoll and as a memorial of sorts to her brother and sister who were murdered by the Nazis in 1943. Additional funding came from American foundations, a Cold War narrative in the making, no doubt. Max Bill, an alum of Bauhaus, was appointed the first director of Ulm, which opened its doors to students in 1955 and closed in 1968. The mission statement of the school appears in the first Ulm journal from October 1958. Journal says, number one, the mission statement of the school appears in the first journal. In the it says, Ulm educates specialists for two different tasks of our technological civilization. One, the design for industrial products. Two, the design of visual and verbal means of communication. The school thus educates designers for the production of consumer goods, industries, as well as present-day means of communication, that being press, film, broadcast, television, and advertising. These designs must have at their disposal the technological and scientific knowledge necessary for collaboration in industry today. Classes offered in the foundation course include a range of topics, including methodology, sociology, perception theory, cultural history of the 20th century, and mathematics, physics, and chemistry. In the visual communications department, classes were taught on technologies of typesetting, process reproduction, printing, and paper, semiotics, history of typography, exhibition design, and film, theory of science, and optional courses in operational research. What this list of course offerings demonstrates is a radical shift away from the quote sense-based craft pedagogy of the Bauhaus toward a pedagogy based on science, history, philosophy, and modern production technologies. The shift was in part due to the influence of Maldonado. In the second issue of Ulm, in 1958, the painter wrote, "The idea which supplies the basis for what might be called Bauhaus ideology are today, a quarter of a century after the institution closed, difficult to translate into language of our present day preoccupations. Furthermore, some of these ideas must now be refuted with the greatest vehemence as well as with the greatest objectivity." And it follows up in 2012 by saying, "We were living in another time. There was the onset of a conflict in which young professionals understood that it was no longer possible to continue with Bauhaus traditions. Because Max Bill proposed the same exercises they did at the Bauhaus, it was a mere repetition of the same ideas. It was a difficult conflict to manage because there were Bill's ideological characteristics and ours, and the conflict grew worse with time. I'm talking about 1955. For example, the Bauhaus was known for not having a library. There was distrust for all that could be considered philosophical and scientific. To further home in on Ulm's pedagogical concerns, consider the position of Louis Bonsepe. We studied at Ulm in the information department from 1955 to 1958. I taught there from 63 until the school's closing. The Invisible Facets of Ulm is the title of a lecture Bonsepe redrafted as an essay for Design Issues, summer 1995, where he elaborated on the history and influences of Ulm. Design opposes the cognitive ideal and the understanding of practice in universities. Design opposes the interpolation of technology prevailing in technological institutions. Design opposes the ideal of aesthetic experience of artistic institutions. Bonsepe goes on to state, design has no place in any of these institutions, and if it did, it would be just tolerated as a foreign body. Bonsepe addresses a problem critical to my project through the metaphor of design as a foreign body. His statement implicitly complicates McCoy's McCoy's statement that graphic design has or ever could satisfy the conditions of disciplinarity. Bonsepi tells us that design, as it relates to the academy, produces a number of structural discontinuities. The academy is not capable of providing an institutional home for design within either the science or the arts. For Deb Littlejohn, design is pre-disciplinary. For Bonsepi, it is anti-disciplinary by default. Bonsepi offers some historical remedies for this formulation of design discourse and its bearings on design education and professional practice. Bonsepi says, Bonsepi here only reclaims and institutes design as an autonomous discipline, which couldn't have allowed to serve as an agency for other disciplines. Thus, it was neither an appendage of nor a supplement to mechanical engineering, nor submissive to marketing, nor a variant of the fine arts in the form of applied arts, or a subcategory of architecture. Design is neither art nor technology nor science, since none of these realms of knowledge provides the distinctions necessary to grasp the concept of design. Only use education with its programmatic disposition to build a bridge to the scientific disciplines. Bohm broke with the long tradition of a skill-oriented institutional program of the craft schools. Design was demystified and treated as a teachable and learnable discipline, with methods whose applications made superfluous the recurrent communication between master and student through osmosis. Putting an even finer point on Deb Littlejohn's characterization of design as pre-disciplinary, Bonsepi, in a somewhat exaggerated tone, continues, design is still in its prehistoric stages, and we find ourselves at a historical moment in relation to the advent of a universal digitization. For the purposes of this project, we might replace the notion of writing For the purposes of the project, we might replace the notion of writing with our own histories to reading them and instead chart the literature that has taken up by generations of graphic designers after the Bauhaus, of course. Rephrasing McCoy's statement, one could say, graphic design moves from a professional practice to a discipline when design reads its own histories and theories. We start with Bonsepi's recollection of the Ulm Library. The list of books held in the small Ulm Library in the mid-50s included the first Amsterdam edition of Horkheimer's and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, the first two-volume edition of Walter Benjamin's writings, and a two-volume edition of Thompson's groundbreaking work on theory on growth and form. The books Bonsepi says were noticed. The books Bonsepi says were noticeably absent are of equal interest, especially considering the date of 1968, when major metropolitan areas around the globe, areas of concentrated intellectual and labor union activities, were ablaze in fervent protests by those who were demanding the halting of war and liberation of the underserved global masses. Now, this is Bonsepi here. Nor would Derrida's writings have found much approval with Ulm, although they certainly would have been discussed had they been better known before 1968. Postmodernism, which Leotard aptly identified as the quote loss of faith in master narratives, also didn't coincide with Ohm's program. It is safe to say, based on the above, that von Sepe, at least in the mid-90s, when the statement was penned, is a proponent of master narratives. This is true. Sheila de Brettville was in Italy working in this pivotal moment of 1968. The formation of her political views was constructed to a large degree by the actions on the streets of Europe and the book she was reading. De Brettville recalls, anyone who lived through the prior 2 years was not untouched by the civil rights movement and the revolution in Paris. I was fascinated by the revolution in May in Paris, in the streets and the graphic output during that time. I was reading Fanon, I was reading Ferrera's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. These books and the Times had a huge impact on me when I began to teach, because from Ferrera, the whole idea that the role of the teacher is to help the student become themselves. I took it to heart. Certainly Fanon's attitude toward institutional racism was part of what was installed in my sensibility. It just had a big effect on the way I thought about people and how I cared about individuals. And certainly Fanon gave me a way of teaching that every student has a body of knowledge of their own that they bring to the class. Now let's compare the old reading list to that of Geoff Kaplan. Here. Now let's compare what the old reading list to what Keedy has to say about his reading habits in the early 80s. Keedy played a significant role in any narration of contemporary design history, particularly related to the institutionalizing impact of the act of reading on design discourse. Following is an excerpt of a conversation I had with Keedy in 2016 about what he was reading as a graduate student and how reading influenced his pedagogical formation as a young teacher. Keedy. It wasn't until 1984, my first year at Cranbrook, when I started reading the journal Visible Language. And Tomocracy, who had published all this stuff about semiotics, the Rhode Island School of Design was big into semiotics. I remember that was a current academic material that was available. It was the most theory that was straight Charles Peirce theory of the sign. I remember starting off with that, reading it and thinking, well, okay, I guess this makes sense, some sense. Science of signs, but it also seemed fairly patched together and therefore not very interesting. Simultaneous to that, all the deconstructive stuff hit seemingly everywhere in art and architecture. Everyone started being interested in French material. And I asked them, the story I heard is that at Cranbrook, you were hanging out with the architectural students and cherry-picking their reading list. Is this true? Keedy says, partially. Actually, it was the presence of Daniel Libeskind, head of the architecture department. He was a big influence. He brought in all these people. Zaha Hadid, for instance, she came. All the big name architects came through. Also, some art critics and art theory people visited. So it was in the air, not at the graphic design, not for graphic design people. My first year at Cranbrook, I met Hani Rashad, a student in architecture. We would talk, and then I would hang out in the architecture department. There's this industrial design student named Alan Cooper. He read a lot. And he started being interested in theory. Also, since we were right next door to Ann Arbor, I used to go over to border books, and there was a whole row, basically a section in the bookstore that contained all the French stuff, including Derrida and semiotics. The University of Michigan's humanities program starting to pick up all this stuff, and I'm like, oh, who's this Roland Barthes guy? It was picking up steam and it was big. It was the thing. You brought these books and their influences into the studio, and from there they found their way into form. Kitty. The reason I'm going to mention Comocracy and Visible Language is that the post-structuralist stuff made more sense to me. It seemed to pick up and push further the theory that was most influential at the time. In the 70s, it was about design methodologies and semiotics and rhetoric. Rhetoric was always a big thing with ocracy. So if you were there and exposed to all these more advanced psychoanalytical influenced notions of language that we were getting from the French writers, it just made sense to me and felt relevant at the time. Pierce seemed too structuralist and out of date. Everyone else realized, wait a minute, look at what Derrida has to say about how language works, from how language is basically used as a cultural construct. Immediately I thought, gosh, that makes a ton of sense for graphic design, because that's what we are doing. We're making cultural constructs. It was a big deal. Although there were a whole bunch of people who hated it. Others thought it was great. It was a certain moment when there was energy in thinking, in critical thinking and in theory. Because I was young and dumb, I naively thought that this was what design really needs to make it and establish it as a cultural practice, not just a bunch of hacks that help people get things printed and sold. I thought this theory is the thing that will cement it and make it part of broader cultural practice. I thought this is going to catch on. And for a while, it was part of the fight of design, not just greasing the wheels of capitalism with style and taste, but as being a cultural practice. Everyone accepts that now. That fight has been won. Design as a cultural practice or as an art practice is now accepted, which in my undergraduate days was not the case. Everyone still had that Paul Rand mentality. This is not art. Don't think you're an artist, Sonny. Oh, there's Paul Rand. Okay, so that's just a beginning of my introduction. Hopefully, frames some of the rest of the book. And I would like now to bring up Ignacio and Fred, the three contributors. Conversation and spill some more water. Thanks for joining me. I'll start asking Ignacio. So Ignacio wrote an essay about the prehistory of graphic design, and Fred writes an essay about the neoliberal tradition of graphic design. So we can start with Ignacio. So would you tell us about how cave paintings, such as those found in Altamira, established to be 36,000 years old, and 20,000-year-old paintings in that so play a role in contemporary culture? And what is a, quote, cave history of graphic design pedagogy?
Well, did I write that? Sometimes what happens when you write some things, you know, and then you are confronted with that. First of all, before, if I may say, I am so pleased to be here. I have been associated with the graduate design program since its inception, with Lucille Tenaza, now our trustee with us, and Linda Matthews, who's now at Parsons. So I have had that privilege. And then I had the privilege to work with Geoff for many years in the class that we made together. So that's fantastic. And now I'm doing this machine modernity class with Eric Adigard, which is also thanks to John that put us together. And so this is kind of like, for me, a little bit of a wonderful opportunity to be here, especially since I'm not a designer. So I'm kind of like maybe an interloper to some extent. So there you have it. So the question of the cave for me came up early on in terms of kind of like exploring issues of that for a long time I had been fascinated with dark spaces, and also the impact that I had when I visited Altamira in Spain when I was working for the UN in Madrid. And so I escaped one weekend and actually was able to see it before they closed it down for good because of environmental issues, etc. But for me to read a cave, any kind of cave, Altamira, etc., creates the possibility of movement. The question of animation, to animate, is an expression that you have of moving about, and but also for me creates the possibility of connection with a shamanic past and the question of survival. To me, the cave in some way represents kind of like a place where a crossover happens, and where people are kind of like confronting or reflecting early on about what is to be human in some ways. But that expression is placed in graphic form, literally. So I would say that in some way the first inklings of a design and graphic form begins in those caves, and even earlier, if you will, more than 100,000 years ago or so. And so this is for me something that is important to think. Then I don't know if you already asked me about Plato or not, or you're going to ask him. Maybe I just go on. So I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to take over this hint. But the cave for me also has the connection to the kind of very fundamental conversation that has been going on in Western thought. In some ways, thanks to Plato. Plato represents to me kind of like a hinge place. I'm not a Platonic per se, but I have studied Plato for a while. And I feel that what he brings up, particularly in places like the Republic and also in the Symposium, is two things that I feel are pertinent to issues for contemporary world in terms of epistemology, knowledge works, the questions of truth, the questions of fake truth, what he talks about ikasia, from which econ or icon, this whole conversation. So that's what I have called him kind of like the first media theorist in some ways, is displayed. But he also through the Symposium, he works on the idea of eros, and so the desired formation, which today in contemporary society, particularly, we were discussing actually earlier before the conversation started here, the neoliberal space is fundamental in the issue of the production of subjectivity, which Deleuze and Guattari and Lacan himself, all of them have touched about. Who are we, how are we, and the whole question of playing with the lack, with desire, with the lack thereof, and so on. It's a long conversation. But I feel that Plato, in many ways, already begins with that. And it so happened that we were, I don't know, lucky or not, but his knowledge and his writings were known thanks to the expansion that happened later on with Hellenistic Greece and the marriage with Judeo-Christian and Roman Christianity, which came to our days, the Middle Ages, Islam, etc. I mean, it's this whole fundamental point there, to the point that Whitehead, the mathematician and process philosopher, said that we could say that the whole of Western thought could be seen as a footnote to Plato. So I think that the importance of Plato in that sense is because in some ways inaugurates a conversation that is directly related to the question of modernity and postmodernity, hyperreal, truth, all of that. So I think this is something, an elaborate thing. And finally, very long answer, the cave, the allegory of the cave. Everybody knows about it, so I'm not going to go into it. But to me, that also connects with Lascaux, with Altamira, with all the other Paleolithic caves.
So I'm going to bounce this over to Fred. I'm not going to ask Fred a question. I'm going to read a paragraph from his essay and then ask him to comment on it. So I want to share the words that Fred wrote. Oh, Fred co-wrote. He said, since the late 1970s, nation states across Europe and America have been deregulating industries, dismantling their social safety nets, and encouraging their citizens to think of themselves as entrepreneurs of their own lives. Design thinking has arisen alongside these policies. Not just alongside, design thinking, in fact, represents a repurposing of 20th century design pedagogy for a neoliberal era. Part ideology, part toolkit for self-transformation, Design thinking has turned the work of designing things into the work of designing a new kind of person, a person fit for a topsy-turvy, innovation-driven, deregulated world.
Yeah, that was me. Wow. Thank you, Geoff, for having me. I'm phenomenally honored to be in the book and in this conversation. I feel really, really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm a cultural historian of America, media technology, and American culture since World War II. And when I look at design and when I look at design thinking, which of course is fully embedded at Stanford. Actually, let me pause for a sec. How many of you have encountered design thinking? Great. Okay, so I won't go too deep on it, on what it is. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. So design thinking is deeply embedded at Stanford, and it's part of, I think, a much larger move that you can see, a kind of wave moving from World War II to the present. It's really about the rise of a kind of technocratic society in which design serves as the mechanism by which we simultaneously can pull back from politics and open ourselves towards sort of self-transformation together as an alternative to a more political world. And this is something you see happening over decades. It's very much in sync with the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, one of the founders of neoliberal economic thought. He believed in the marketplace as a site of constant signaling in which you would be free to live alongside others, and in which you would simply tell them what you were like, what you wanted. They would set a price, you would set a price, and order would emerge. In a world in which order is supposed to emerge and people are supposed to find themselves, there's a tremendous premium on expression, on individual expression. And that premium, I think, is something for which the history of design pedagogy offers a series of techniques that meant one thing in Bauhaus Europe in the 30s, when set up against Hitler, but can mean something quite different now. That urge, in one of your earlier slides, you showed something about the Bauhaus folks training for kind of individual expression. Individual expression in an era of Facebook, Meta, systems that surround us in an effort to solicit and monetize our individuality means something quite different. And in that context, a series of techniques taught at an elite institution that are designed explicitly to help you, as they say there, not think, not reflect, but make. Make, always be making. If you're always making, then you don't have to think too hard about the context you're making in, or what you're making for, or what the goals are. It's not my responsibility when the bombs come down, said Bernard von Braun. And that's a real challenge. And so, anyways, I can rant more, but I think I'll pass it back to Geoff.
I want to pull out another nugget here that's, for me, crystallizes maybe my agenda for the project. And Fred and Annika say, design thinking has transformed the historically specific working habits of designers into a dehistoricized, depoliticized toolkit to help neoliberal elites manage their lives and the institutions they someday or already lead. Can you talk a little bit more about this dehistoricizing and depoliticizing move?
Yeah, so design is an enormously powerful discipline in many ways. But if you can, I'm trying to do this succinctly. One of the things that happens if you spend your whole life in rooms with books is you start talking about books, and you also can't pull all the books together quickly in your head. I'm going to try to. At least since the 60s, Americans in particular have had an incredible distrust of institutions and of politics. And American corporations have taken that on board and developed modes of management that simultaneously solicit and celebrate the individuality of their workers, and then find ways to turn that individuality into profit centers. So Facebook famously says in its recruiting, bring your whole self to work. I've spent a lot of time inside the building at Facebook, the headquarters at Facebook, and they have an art program there, which it aims to explicitly design the environment for the coders who work there as one that is symbolically rich and filled with essentially identity art. When you come through the front door, there's a sign, or there was a sign last time I was there, said, take care of, and then it listed LGBTQ, Black, Asian American, on down that list. And it was super interesting. This is Facebook? Silence equals death was another poster. And when did Facebook fight AIDS? You know, what's happening here is, I think, this sort of solicitation of individual expression such that you can become someone who manages yourself and uses technical systems, design itself, in particularly in interface settings, to control the participation of others. If you depoliticize that, you say, this isn't politics, I'm just helping people express themselves. Who could object to that? Who could object to freeing people to express themselves? And yet, freeing people to express themselves in an era that's not unlike the Foucauldian prison we saw earlier, an era in which surveillance is ubiquitous and profits are made from surveillance, it has quite a different valence. I guess the last thing I want to say is that management technique, and some of you have probably been managers, you know, really has to strike this balance. We can't do the old 20th century Taylorist thing of, I give you an order and I give you a salary, unless you're working at McDonald's. At elite levels, we have to help you feel like a whole person. We have to give you room to be yourself, and we have to find ways to align your personal life mission with the mission of the corporation you're working for. And that's, in many cases, in Silicon Valley, the work of design.
So questions from where you at?
You feel it's a good time, we should.
Oh, yeah, okay, I want to ask a general question, and we can open it up. So there was a statement that the school released in conjunction with the 9th event, and I saw it on Instagram, and this is what it said. It said, interested in learning how, quote, design thinking for issues such as climate change and social media optimization has influenced graphic design throughout time, then join us tonight. So as a way to open it up to the audience, do you want to try to respond to that question?
The question is, let me see. How design thinking for issues such as climate change and social media optimization has influenced graphic design through time. Well, I mean, maybe it's a little bit pretentious for me to comment here on high and talk. But I do feel, honestly, in the whole period of time that I have been having the privilege of teaching at CCA over a quarter of a century, literally, is that so many things have changed. And something that was touted as gung-ho and successful, which was the neoliberal project with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and General Pinochet in Chile. You should not forget that. And also Deng Xiaoping in China. Those are the kind of like the initiators of the neoliberal project. Kind of like found itself tanking last week in the UK with the process that Liz Truss, the new prime minister, decided that, you know, 25 years of concentration of insane and obscene concentration of power and wealth has not happened. And that it was the best idea just to give back tons and tons, billions of pounds to the super rich, because that would trickle down to everybody. And we now have 40 years of data that it really didn't work that way. So my way of introducing this is now what is design and graphic design in itself going to confront? We can no longer really continue as usual. Ian right now has happened in Florida, the story part of Puerto Rico, and now the Fort Myers area is destroyed. Typhoons in Japan. I mean, you know the whole story, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But the fundamental question, and this is harkens back to my, you know, half a century literally of working in environmental issues, both as an environmental policy person and also an academic aspect. And I feel that this is something that to which potentially design can have some things to tell us because of the particular way in which it kind of organizes thinking. And so potentially, are we going to sell more fancy labels and Coca-Colas to play to the what Lacan would call the imaginary, and you know, more and more stuff and more things and more images, or are we going to be part of the solution, but not solutionism? But Fred was talking a moment ago, and his wonderful work. Actually, I recommend reading him really seriously because of the whole question about what is instrumentalization of life that has become. Now, but the other point that I always have found fascinating with design and in the arts in general is the play. Can we help the world and being playful too? We don't have to be stern and dark and all of that, although there's plenty of it to look at it, from Ukraine to Sudan to Bolsonaro, almost on the verge of becoming again president in Brazil. I mean, so all these things are really something to make us really concerned. But at the same time, there are certain tools and abilities and capacities that we can make a splash and something, and I always have felt that we can always make good, whatever that is, in our neck of the woods. We don't have to change the world, but we can change our world. And this is where we feel. And I always tell my students, well, because of your age, you're likely to live to the end of the century. What are you thinking about for the next 80 years of your life? Just more labels, or playing with Coca-Cola and PepsiCo and Nestle and saying that water is not a human right, or so on and so forth. We could go on and on. And so I feel that there is this question where design has to grow up in that sense. And it has to use its enormous power, its enormous capacity to play with text, with image, with sound, with all kinds of things that are right now the staff of all the fantasies of techno-fetishism, and revert it to survival. Someone guy going back to the cave and remember that you know just about the shadows out of the cave. We have to go back out to the light.
Thank you all for the talk and the conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. We can make it open for questions. Let's look at this and see if there are any questions from the live feed, but also want to open it up to anybody in the room who'd like to has a question for any of the Geoff or any of the panelists. Anybody want to start us off, or do we have to go to? You have a question.
Well, I guess I'll run the like it.
Yeah, speak into the mic, yeah, because it's being on the feed.
Hello, my name is Jordan Fitzgerald, and I guess my question is how do through all this, like how do we really better, excuse me, how do we better critique the design as we go along with this idea of, you know, how can we use design as in a better how can we use design in a better light, because you know I guess it's more along the lines of who do we listen to, like how do we even how do we even go about making design this how do we go about as not to put it, how do we better grow up design from where we are right now?
Thank you for that question. I'm gonna take a shot at it. So I just want to out myself. I'm completely not a designer. And if you asked me to put two images together in a way that was exciting and engaging, it just wouldn't happen. So, you know, so I'll take the privilege of a non-practitioner and say there are two things I've noticed in the design world that I've studied that are very powerful tactics. One powerful tactic is prototyping. Prototyping, you know, for a design purpose, brings together communities that might not otherwise be together. And the prototyping process itself, and then the prototypes themselves, model different ways a world can be organized. And if you do that, you give people who experience your prototypes chances to imagine a different and better world. So that's the positive move, prototype well. On the flip side, the critical move that's always seemed important to me that is a tough thing if you have to make a living in the world, is pay attention to who you're working for. And ask yourself, you know, is this something that I value? Is this something, and you know, there may be times when you have to work for folks you don't love. That's part of making a living, fair enough. But when you can, make choices that see you serving your values. Those are the two things I've got.
Okay, I'm gonna go to a question online, which was, does the panel have some ideas of how to message a post-growth vision of the future?
Maybe I could talk a little bit about that. Actually, since I'm originally from Colombia, South America, Bogota, blah, blah, blah. Right now, for the first time, Colombia, which is a very conservative country, has for the first time sort of a social democrat president, in which was a former guerrilla, M19, etc. And of course, the right wing in Colombia is up in arms and doesn't find a way to destroy the possibilities of change. It's interesting because the Secretary of State of the US was in Bogota just a couple of days ago, touting Petro, who's the name of the new president, Gustavo Petro, as a leader in environmental policy in the world. And I bring it up to the question of post-growth, because the Minister of Mines and Energy at Colombia, is a woman, amazingly capable and academic, and also an activist from a long time ago, as well as the vice president of the country, Francia Marquez, who is an Afro-Colombian. She's a Black Colombian who won the Goldman Environmental Prize, which is noted as the Nobel Prize of Environment. So she was here back in 2018. So she's the vice president of the country. And it's a big controversy right now about degrowth. And I'm kind of like placing it into a context of a society, specific society like Colombia. The point is basically, we don't have planet B. I think that the answer is, what are we going to do? We only have planet A. And so the fantasy of neoclassical economics and the intensification of neoliberalism, that we can grow and grow and grow and grow. The fantasy of Liz Truss last week in the UK, that tanked the sterling pound and created a humongous thing that they had to make a U-turn because people say, no, you're going to destroy the country, the pound, the economy, and as a sidewalk, the environment. And so I feel that today we are confronted with, we need to really be serious about understanding that we have, especially in a global society, we only have one planet. This is it. Mr. Bezos can go to the moon, but that's really only for him.
I just have a quick add to that. I think the big challenge is, how do we design for a world in which consumption is not our way to political change? If we're designing for consumption, then we're accelerating the engines that are driving us into trouble. So we have to design what in the 18th century they call the civic space. And the word civic is sort of bland and dry, and sort of smells like the Enlightenment, and so it's not very attractive. But I think that's incredibly important. And here again, prototyping matters. I'm aware of some designs for city parks that are in New York that are designed to contain water when the floods come, but also to produce civic spaces where different communities that aren't talking to each other right around the park can and do come together. If you can design places not in the commercial space, but in the civic space, where people who are different can come together and, in the case of the park I'm thinking of, have fire pits at night, that's how you build a different world. And you give people a glimpse of a world in which to find themselves. They don't need to buy that new pair of shoes. They don't need to buy the perfect outfit. I mean, they don't need to buy anything. They just need to get together, light a fire, and have dinner.
I think we have time for one more question if anybody wants to. Here you go.
Okay, I guess I've heard a couple of critiques of design thinking since studying here, but I've never heard one about how design thinking depoliticizes and dehistoricizes design. And I think a lot of design thinkers, I guess, might say that their work politicizes and maybe not historicizes design, but certainly adds context. And I'm wondering if you could go deeper on to your take.
Thank you so much. I was hoping somebody would ask that question. Thank you very much. So I'm going to let myself get a little academic and a little tedious. They're like, oh yeah, go on, can't wait. So Design thinking, so the essay in the book, Annika Butler-Wall and I spent some time looking really closely at design thinking materials, again, with Stanford as our primary case, and with some of the major texts of the movement as the primary sort of think spots. And what's interesting about that is when you look at those quite closely, you see a series of prescriptions for individual behaviors and practices that enrich the communities feeding into the object to be designed or the process to be designed, but that say nothing or almost nothing about outcomes except as defined by the people who you're designing for. So you want to get to know your customer real well. That's not news. But the idea of getting to know your customer real well is proposed as a mechanism of personal growth. So here are, for example, the 8 core abilities that you need to develop in design thinking. I won't read all of them, but navigate ambiguity, learn from others, synthesize information. These are things that you're supposed to do as a good entrepreneurial person in a world that's assumed to already be a place where entrepreneurship is rewarded. And design thinking, in many ways, I've always thought of it as a kind of entrepreneurial recipe for design. Go out, find a customer, learn it, come back. There's no talk there about growth, about the larger political context, about the who. It's a kind of method that lets you work for anybody. And it can work on anybody. And it's proposed that way. Well, that's a problem. There's some somebodies you don't really want to help. I mean, you may be familiar with the new book which is about McKinsey. You know, McKinsey will help anyone. Their ideology is not unlike design thinking. We're here to be helpful. We're here to do the right thing. We're here to broaden your community of users. All of that's great, so long as the users are benevolent. But if you exclude the question of the communities that you're serving, you end up in all kinds of trouble. There's a poster, there's a picture of this in the book, which I rather like. And it's from the central space in the design lab at Stanford, in the D School. Nothing is a mistake, it says. There's no win and no fail. There's only make. The first 2 sentences there are like straight California Buddhism, right? Be at ease with yourself. Everything's good. You are who you are. You are the person you are now. The last one is, make, produce, take action. Nowhere in that sentence is pay attention to the community you're a part of. Serve your community. There's no ethos of service here. There's an ethos of building. You serve your customer, but your client is already determined by the commercial relation. There's no sense that you choose a client who needs serving. It's in that sense that it's depoliticized. It's tremendously effective within the boundaries of the thing that it sets out to do. But the boundaries that it sets out to do deliberately, explicitly, and for profit fence off the political questions to which we might otherwise speak.
Thank you. Thank all of you, Geoff, and everyone for the great thoughts. And I think there's a lot of conversation that will follow this up. I just want to repeat that Geoff's book is for sale there. We have 6 of them. So if anybody,
It's filled, I mean, seriously, it is filled with gems. If I were a design student, I would want this on my desk now.
Yeah.
It's like it's the perfect bedside book, just saying. Flip it over and it's like, oh, I didn't think about that.
So thank you to Fred Ignacio as well for being up here, and great pitch, Fred. Anyhow, but thank you all again for coming to this event. Geoff will be here for a minute, and I'm sure Fred and Ignacio will hang out. So if anybody has some follow-up questions, they'd love to talk to you. So thanks again for coming, and good night, and have a safe evening.